Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. It was just another Monday when everything started to feel off. Karen and I had been married for 11 years, with 2 kids we both adored. She'd always been the outgoing one between us, quick to make friends and always planning social events. I loved that about her once. But lately, something was different. I'd catch her smiling at her phone or hear her giggling at a text, only to brush it off when I asked about it. She'd become distant in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried convincing myself I was reading too much into things. But my gut wouldn't settle. Then came the book club. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, Karen loved reading, and it wasn't unusual for her to get together with friends. Yet, I found it strange that the meetings were suddenly every Thursday night without fail. She used to come home with books to show the kids, or even give me a quick rundown of what her group was reading. Now, she'd just come home, change quickly, and go straight to bed without a word. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh and wave me off, saying, "You'd hate book club, nothing but wine and gossip." I wasn't sure why, but the way she laughed seemed forced. One day, a small slip of paper fell from her purse. She was in the other room, chatting on the phone, her voice animated as she talked to one of her friends. The slip looked like any old receipt at first, crumpled from being stuffed in her purse. But when I picked it up, the bold scrawl caught my eye, "Josh," followed by, "Last night was unforgettable." My heart hammered as I reread the note, a wave of anger mixing with disbelief. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that had gnawed at me for weeks. Over the next few days, I felt like a stranger in my own house. Every glance from her felt hollow, every smile a cover for something hidden. Our morning conversations became less frequent, replaced by silence as she poured her coffee, her eyes a million miles away. Even our kids seemed to notice. "Is Mommy okay?" our daughter asked one morning. I assured her that everything was fine, but deep down, I knew I was lying, to her and myself. When Thursday rolled around, I decided to ask her outright. I was nervous, unsure of how she'd respond, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of things. As she got ready, I watched her from the bedroom doorway. "You're going to book club again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She glanced at me, barely pausing as she applied her lipstick. "Yeah, why?" "You've never minded before," she replied casually. I hesitated. "It just feels like you're gone a lot lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. She looked at me, her face a mask of calm, but I could see something flicker in her eyes. "Come on, it's just once a week," she said, her tone dismissive. "It's nothing to worry about." "All right," I replied, but the unease lingered. I watched as she grabbed her bag, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and walked out the door. It felt strange, detached, like she was already somewhere else. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every little thing, her smiles at her phone, the slip of paper, her sudden defenses. By morning, I was exhausted, but a decision had formed. I had to know for sure. I wasn't going to confront her without solid proof. So, I decided to follow her next time. The following Thursday, I left work early, determined to get to the bottom of it. I parked down the street from our house and waited until she left, my stomach in knots as I watched her drive off. I followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. She drove across town and parked in front of a small, quiet restaurant. It wasn't the kind of place I'd expect for a book club meeting. I watched as she went inside, her face lighting up as she scanned the room. A few minutes later, a man joined her. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile. She laughed as he approached, and they embraced briefly before sitting down. My heart sank as I watched them talk, her body language open and animated, a side of her I hadn't seen in months. It was as if she'd saved all her warmth, her laughter, for him. They lingered over dinner, oblivious to everything around them. I felt like I was in some terrible dream, rooted to the spot as they shared a meal I thought was just a cover for her book club. She'd always been a good liar, I realized. I couldn't even remember the last time she'd looked at me like that, her face open and unguarded. When they finally left, I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could still see their smiles, their easy comfort with each other. Everything I'd thought I knew about my life, my marriage, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But amid the shock and betrayal, a new feeling began to form, a cold determination. If this was who she'd chosen to be, if she'd decided to break everything we'd built together, I wasn't going to be the one left with nothing. The drive home was a blur. By the time I got there, Karen had already returned, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine, acting as if nothing was wrong. She looked up when I entered, her expression one of mild surprise. "Hey, you're home early," she said, swirling her wine. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just had a long day." She raised her glass in a half-hearted toast and went back to her phone, the same distant look on her face. But now, I knew the reason behind it. And as I looked at her, sitting there without a care in the world, I felt the anger inside me harden into resolve. She might think she had this all under control, but I had no intention of being the fool in her story. For the next few days, I replayed that night over and over, dissecting every moment. I'd been an idiot, blind to the signs that now seemed so obvious. All the late nights, the book club, cover stories, even the way she'd gradually pulled away from me and the kids. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but every time I thought about it, I felt the need for something more, proof, a way to make sure she couldn't twist her way out of it. She'd been too convincing with her lies. I needed irrefutable evidence. That Friday, I took the day off work. Karen didn't suspect anything, she was already out with the kids, running errands. While she was gone, I combed through her things, checking the places I'd once considered too private to ever touch. Her purse, her dresser, her nightstand drawers, all seemed surprisingly clean, too clean, until I found her old phone shoved in the back of her closet. It was a spare, or so she'd told me once, in case her current one ever broke. She'd never mentioned it since, and I almost left it there. But something made me take it out and turn it on. As it powered up, I felt my pulse quicken. Most of the messages were older, ones from our kids, her mom, and a few friends. Then I found a contact simply named Josh, hidden away in her messaging app. I clicked on it, and there they were, hundreds of messages going back months, filled with inside jokes, flirty remarks, and private moments I'd never known. Reading them felt like standing on a ledge, teetering between rage and despair. In one message, Josh mentioned their last book club dinner and how he couldn't wait until next Thursday. Another talked about their weekend plans, something I knew Karen had never told me about. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through, piecing together her double life. The worst part was that she'd even mentioned me a few times, dismissing me as too focused on work, a convenient excuse for her absence. Seeing her words like that, so casually hurtful, shattered something inside me. This wasn't just some fling, she'd chosen to rewrite our life, our marriage, with me as nothing more than a footnote. That night, I couldn't look at her. She was her usual self, laughing with the kids, asking me about my day with a warm smile. I answered in one-syllable replies, but she didn't seem to notice. The sight of her, the sheer normalcy of her presence, made my skin crawl. How could she do this? How could she be so comfortable in her lies? Over the weekend, I decided I couldn't just sit with the anger. I needed a plan, something that would give me the upper hand. First, I took steps to secure my finances. I had savings she didn't know about, investments I'd kept separate from our joint account. I moved the funds into a new account under my name, leaving only what was needed to cover household expenses. I didn't want her to suspect anything, not yet. Next, I decided to reach out to an old friend, Tom. He was a private investigator, someone I'd known since college. We weren't particularly close anymore, but we'd stayed in touch over the years. When I called him, he could hear the edge in my voice right away. "Need some help, don't you?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, barely managing to keep the anger out of my voice. "It's Karen. I know she's seeing someone." "All right, I've got you," he said, his voice a mix of understanding and professionalism. "Let's start with the basics. I'll look into her movements, see if I can track this guy down. But, be sure this is what you want. Once we start, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said, the words coming out cold and sharp. "Just let me know what you find." By midweek, Tom called with an update. Karen had met Josh again on Tuesday, this time at a hotel just outside of town. He'd managed to snap photos of them together, even catching a shot of them kissing before they slipped inside. He was willing to keep digging, but he assured me there was more than enough evidence already. When I saw the photos, it was like a punch to the gut. The images were grainy but clear enough to see her face, her smile, the look she gave him, one she hadn't given me in years. The finality of it hit hard, but there was also a strange, quiet satisfaction. This was what I'd needed, proof she couldn't argue against, couldn't manipulate her way out of. That night, I came home late, too drained to play the role of the oblivious husband. Karen was waiting up, watching TV with her feet tucked under her, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I came in, her smile a bit tentative. "You all right?" she asked. "You seem distant lately." I almost laughed at the irony. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," I said, brushing past her. But when I turned back, she was watching me, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You sure? You don't seem like yourself." I bit back the reply that sat on my tongue, settling instead for a curt nod. "I'm fine, Karen. Just tired." The next morning, I knew it was time to confront her. My anger was a quiet, burning flame now, controlled but dangerous. I planned it out carefully, setting everything up while she was out. I laid out the photos, the printouts of their messages, all the proof of her betrayal. And when she walked through the door that afternoon, her usual breezy smile vanished the second she saw the evidence spread across the kitchen table. Her face went pale, her eyes darting between the photos and me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. For once, her usual calm facade had cracked. What is this?" she stammered, trying to gather herself. I didn't give her the chance. "You know exactly what this is, Karen," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but every word heavy with anger. "It's everything you've been hiding from me. Every lie you've told to cover up your little affair." She tried to speak, but no words came out. I could see the gears turning in her mind as she searched for some way out, some excuse that would make everything okay. But there was no way out this time. "So how long has this been going on?" I demanded. "How long have you been sneaking around, lying to me, lying to our kids?" She looked away, her shoulders sagging as the weight of it all pressed down on her. It's not what you think," she mumbled, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Don't insult me by trying to downplay this," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos. I know about the hotel. I know about all of it. So just be honest with me, for once." Silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, barely audible. "It's been a few months. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. "You didn't mean for it, but here we are." She flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her words felt hollow, empty. They didn't undo the betrayal, the lies, the months of secrecy. I took a deep breath, my mind racing through everything I'd planned for this moment. "You know, Karen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I used to think we had something real. I thought we were in this together. But it seems I was wrong. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. She'd chosen this, chosen him over me, over our family. And now, there was no going back. As I turned to leave, I heard her call my name, a desperate, pleading sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. But I didn't stop. I'd spent enough time believing her lies. Now, it was time to focus on my own path, one that no longer included her. After the confrontation, I stayed out of the house as much as possible. The kids were my priority, and I didn't want them to see the cracks in our lives that Karen's affair had created. She tried reaching out a few times, calling and texting, but I ignored every message. She had her chance to come clean, to talk to me before everything imploded. Now, there was nothing left to say. The following days were a surreal mix of hurt and numbness. I threw myself into work, barely pausing to eat or sleep. Every time I came home, Karen was waiting. She'd look at me with eyes swollen from crying, a new fragility in her face that once might have softened my anger. But it was too late for that now. One evening, after another long day, I walked into the living room to find her sitting on the couch, twisting her hands in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her gaze pleading. "Please, can we talk?" she whispered. I sighed, setting down my keys. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Karen." She flinched as if I'd slapped her but took a shaky breath. "I know I messed up. I know I've hurt you. But I didn't want this to happen, any of it." I scoffed, the bitterness rising again. "You didn't want this? Then why did you keep lying to me, night after night, week after week? You had every chance to stop this before it got to this point." "I was afraid," she said, her voice trembling. "Afraid of what you'd think of me if I told you how I felt, afraid of. I don't know, losing you. You lost me the second you started sneaking around," I replied, the edge in my voice making her eyes well up again. I wanted to feel something, anything that wasn't anger or resentment, but there was nothing left. She tried to move closer, her hand reaching out, but I stepped back, crossing my arms over my chest. "Don't," I warned. "Don't try to make this about how I didn't listen, or how I somehow pushed you into this. You're the one who did this, not me." Karen's shoulders slumped, and for a long moment, silence filled the room. I thought she might walk away, leave me to deal with the emptiness that had settled over everything. But instead, she whispered, "What about the kids? They don't understand what's going on. They're asking questions. They deserve to know." At that, a pang of guilt twisted in my chest. I hadn't told them anything, hadn't given them a reason for why things felt so strained between their mom and me. But they were bright kids, they could feel the tension. The smiles at the dinner table, the goodnight hugs, all of it had become a painful charade. They deserved better than that, better than being caught in the crossfire. "I'll talk to them," I said finally. "But we need to be honest, at least with them. They need to know that this isn't their fault, and that we both love them. Beyond that, I don't owe you any explanations." Karen nodded slowly, her expression one of quiet resignation. As much as I wanted to hate her, seeing her look so broken stirred something else, a bitter sadness for the life we'd built and lost. The next evening, I sat down with the kids. Karen sat nearby, silent, her face pale as she listened. Our daughter was the first to speak, her eyes wide and scared. "Are you and Mommy getting a divorce?" she asked, her voice so small it hurt. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "We're going through a tough time right now," I said gently. "But it has nothing to do with you or your brother. We both love you so much, and that's never going to change." "But why are you and Mommy mad at each other?" our son piped up, frowning as he looked from me to Karen. "It's complicated," I replied, glancing at Karen. "But we're going to do everything we can to make sure you both are safe and happy. We're still a family, no matter what happens." After we put the kids to bed, Karen and I sat in the kitchen, the silence heavy around us. She looked up at me, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. Is there any way to fix this?" she asked quietly. "To get back to where we were?" Her words hung in the air, filling the empty space between us. Once, I would have been willing to do anything to hold on to our life together. But now, the idea felt foreign, even painful. She'd made her choice, and in doing so, had broken something that couldn't be mended. "I don't know," I said, my voice flat. "I really don't know if there's anything left to fix." She swallowed, nodding as if she'd expected that answer. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I was selfish, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I love you. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I still love you." Her words rang hollow. I wanted to believe her, to let that love be enough to rebuild our marriage. But trust, once shattered, was impossible to piece back together with apologies alone. Over the next few weeks, I focused on keeping the house together, putting up a brave front for the kids. Karen and I spoke only when necessary, the space between us growing colder with each passing day. She moved into the guest bedroom, and soon enough, we became little more than strangers sharing the same house. One Saturday morning, as I was cleaning out the garage, Karen approached me, wringing her hands nervously. "I think I should move out for a while," she said softly. "Maybe give us both some space." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. "That's probably for the best." She looked down, her face crumpling slightly, but she held back the tears. "I'll still come by to see the kids, of course. I want to be there for them, even if," her voice trailed off, as if the words were too painful to finish. We didn't say much after that. Karen spent the next day packing up her things, filling suitcases with pieces of a life we'd once shared. The kids didn't understand, and I had to explain again that things were changing, that Mommy was going to stay somewhere else for a while but that we'd still be there for them, no matter what. As I watched her drive away, I felt an odd mixture of sadness and liberation. The anger that had consumed me was fading, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She was gone, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. A few days later, I sat down with Tom, the private investigator who'd helped me gather everything. We talked about the divorce process, how to ensure it went as smoothly as possible. I wanted to protect the kids, to keep their lives as stable as I could, and Tom assured me that we'd handle it all with care. Karen and I filed for divorce shortly afterward. We agreed to co-parent as amicably as possible, though every conversation felt like a forced exercise in civility. She apologized again, countless times, but I remained unmoved. It was like she'd drained every ounce of trust and love I'd once had for her. In the end, there was nothing left to save. As the months passed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I focused on the kids, on work, on finding happiness in small moments. It wasn't easy, but slowly, the memories of Karen's betrayal faded, replaced by the peace I'd found in letting go. One night, after tucking the kids into bed, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything we'd been through. I knew that the scars of our marriage would always remain, faint reminders of a life I'd left behind. But I also knew I'd found something valuable in the wreckage, my own resilience, my ability to move forward despite the pain. And in that quiet moment, I realized that I was finally free. Months passed, and I found a strange kind of rhythm again. Life without Karen was far from what I'd imagined, but the days fell into a pattern that felt normal, even comforting. I focused on work, poured myself into every small joy with the kids, and made peace with the fact that Karen and I would never rebuild what we had. The anger, the resentment, those emotions had faded, leaving only a quiet sadness. I thought I was ready to move forward, to let go for good. But life had other plans. One autumn evening, as the air started turning cool and the leaves were falling in waves of gold and red, I was sitting at home with the kids, helping them with homework. Our daughter was laughing over some story, and our son was trying to read me a paragraph he'd written for school. For the first time in a long time, I felt a warmth settle over me, the kind I used to feel when our family was whole. It didn't replace what I'd lost, but it was close enough. Then the phone rang. Seeing Karen's number light up on the screen, I hesitated. She'd usually text if it was about the kids, and we rarely called each other unless something was wrong. A bad feeling clawed at me, so I picked up, trying to steady my voice. Karen. There was a long pause, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. Is this James? Yes, this is he. I felt my heart start to pound. This is Dr. Sinclair from County General. I'm calling from the emergency room. There's been an accident. Your wife, Karen, she was brought in tonight. It's serious. My mind went blank. I didn't hear what else he said, only caught phrases about intensive care, critical condition, and time-sensitive surgery. Everything around me blurred. I hung up without realizing, numbness filling my chest as I told the kids to stay with our neighbor. They looked up at me, worried, but I managed a calm explanation as best I could, saying I needed to check on their mom and would be back soon. The drive to the hospital was a blur. I could barely process what was happening. After all the betrayal, all the anger, the distance and pain, it never crossed my mind that I'd be racing to see Karen like this, to be by her side in an emergency I wasn't prepared for. Part of me wanted to hate her for putting me through this, for still being able to make my heart race with fear, despite everything. But a deeper part of me just hoped she'd be okay, that this wasn't the final chapter of our story. When I reached the hospital, they took me to the ICU. Karen was unconscious, lying motionless on the bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her. Her face was pale, her chest barely rising under the weight of the machines. A nurse explained that her car had been hit head-on by a drunk driver, that the crash had been brutal, and she'd been lucky to make it here alive. But her luck seemed to end there. The doctors weren't optimistic. They'd done what they could, but her injuries were extensive. It was only a matter of time. I sat beside her, feeling the weight of grief settle over me like a lead blanket. I reached out, hesitantly, taking her cold hand in mine. It was strange, touching her again, feeling the familiar warmth of her fingers, now cold and lifeless. I thought of the good times we'd had before everything went wrong, of the nights we'd stayed up talking, the laughter, the closeness I'd once believed was unbreakable. Now, she was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Hours passed. I talked to her, not sure if she could hear me, but hoping, somehow, that my words reached her. I told her about the kids, about how they missed her, how they didn't understand why things had changed so much between us. I whispered apologies, for the anger, the hurt, the way we'd let our love slip away. And somewhere in the dark, amid all the memories and regret, I found it in myself to forgive her. I knew she couldn't hear it, but I needed to say it, to let go of the resentment that had poisoned so much of my life. Just as the first light of dawn began creeping through the window, I felt her fingers twitch, a faint squeeze. Her eyes fluttered, and for the briefest moment, she looked at me, truly looked at me, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and I knew, without a doubt, that she was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was an apology, or maybe just a goodbye. James, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I'm so sorry. I nodded, choking back tears. It's okay, Karen. It's all okay. I forgive you. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and then, as quickly as it came, the light in her eyes faded. Her hand went slack, her breathing slowed, and just like that, she was gone. The machines let out a steady tone, one that signaled the end of everything we'd once shared. I stayed there, holding her hand, until the nurses came in, gently telling me it was time. The next few days passed in a haze. I had to explain to the kids what had happened, had to see the disbelief and heartbreak in their eyes as they tried to understand why their mother would never come home. The funeral was quiet, only family and a few friends, people who'd been there for us when times were good. I tried to hold myself together for the kids, tried to be the rock they needed, but the grief crept in, clawing at the places that had already been hurt by betrayal, loss, and the regret of things left unsaid. Life went on, though it felt hollow. I returned to the routines I'd built, but now every small moment felt like a reminder of her, of what we'd had and lost, and the empty space she'd left behind. As the weeks turned into months, I thought about the way she'd looked at me that last time, her eyes holding that silent apology. I clung to it, hoping that wherever she was, she'd found peace, hoping that somehow, she knew I'd forgiven her. And as time went by, I began to heal, slowly, painfully, but fully. I'd never imagined that I'd lose her twice, first to betrayal, and then, just as I'd found forgiveness, to something more permanent. Yet as I looked at our children, saw bits of her in their smiles and laughter, I realized she'd left me one last gift, a reason to keep going, to hold on to love, even in the face of loss. Life had taken her away, but the love I had for my kids, for the family we tried to build, remained. And in that love, in every moment I spent with them, Karen's memory lived on, a bittersweet reminder of all we'd shared, and the second chance at happiness that I would never take for granted.